Listen here, I'm gonna have to give a warning that what lies ahead, while incredibly rich in fantasy lore and mysteries, unfortunately contains spoilers for nearly all of Baldur's Gate 3. And this time, we're even stretching out towards the overarching scope of the Forgotten Realms, the lands in which this game takes place. Because, well, how on earth are you supposed to get a real grasp as to what these worshipped gods are all about when you have to read to do so? Enough of this. It's time to get serious, as the topic of this video is no laughing matter. The tragic tale of Kethric Thorm. I'm sure you've seen that one plastered on a Reddit post or something somewhere. No, but honestly, I was surprised as to just how detailed the story to this guy was after looking further into his history. Being the central villain standing in our way during the duration of Act 2, there's no shortage of moments for this figure to establish a dominant impression on the player, lasting until his eventual demise at our hands prior to Act 3. But while being able to provide an extreme sense of strength and formidability throughout his time in command of those serving the Absolute, we would be doing his character a disservice if we only took him at face value like that without digging deeper. What makes Kethric Thorm so unique as a character within this game is that he's followed two other gods prior to his current involvement within the events of Baldur's Gate 3. When we encounter him in Moonrise Towers, he's at the point of being in worship of the god of necromancy, Myrkul. And while we can learn the gist of why he's so devout to the Lord of Bones simply by reading some dialogue, through books and journals scattered around, as well as some context concerning what role religion has to play in the Forgotten Realms altogether, we can come to understand many more wholesome layers to this brute of a character. Welcome to Figuring Out Fantasy, where we'll be diving deep into the tragic tale of Kethric Thorm, and trying to discover just what course of events has led him to stand before us as such a battered and broken individual.
I'll tell you a story, true soul.
Our story begins with two sisters, and as sisters do, they fought, endlessly. But these were no normal beings, and their conflicts were not just simple high school dramas. These siblings, which took on a yin and yang identity, consisted of Selûne the Moon Maiden and Shar the Lady of Loss. Being the goddesses of moonlight and darkness respectively, it's pretty obvious why these two entities clashed in the skies throughout time. But as ages went by, more conflicting interests continued to drive a wedge between their two ideologies. Most notably, the birth of a goddess we might have heard of from our favorite wizard of Waterdeep, Mystra. Or, wait, no, this one's Mistral? Mistra's the second incarnation of her that we meet in Baldur's Gate 3. Okay, gotcha. What would you guys do without me? Or, more like, what would I do without the Forgotten Realms wiki? Anyways, the concept of Mistral came to be through one of the battles between Selûne and Shar. This battle had manifested from the Moon Maiden, taking it upon herself to grant the land of Abir Torilla's sun to shine on its soil. And true to the Mistress of the Night, Shar's nature, she sought to extinguish that light just as she had been trying to do with her sister all these years. After Shar gained the upper hand in battle though, her moonlit sister desperately tore a piece of her own being and hurled it as a weapon in an attempt to make a decisive blow. This trump card collected a piece of Shar's being and cast it into the void. And after centuries, the almighty goddess of magic Mistral enters the fray to mediate the two clashing deities. But while supposed to be acting as an imperial lawmaker between the two, the simple aspect of her similarities to Selûne made it apparent that there was always going to be a preference for the light. This had thrust Shar into a state of hiding, as Mistral had demanded that they each occupy their respective domains. Selûne in the lands above where her light will shine, and Shar in the depths of the Underdark where her darkness persisted. And in the time that would follow, the way that Shar approached her following began to be a bit more sadistic in nature, where she would derive enjoyment from the suffering of her followers in a cycle of never-ending feelings of loss. This is what would lead to her often being denoted as the Lady of Loss, especially in the setting of Baldur's Gate 3. Oh wow, yeah, we're still talking about that game. I forgot. Well, it is quite important to know the origins of each of these gods that pretty much started this whole shebang, especially considering how integral they are to each of the centerpieces of this story. The Thorm family has been through it all, but none have a clearer perspective on each of the chaotic events than the central villain of the second act to Baldur's Gate 3, Kethric Thorm. And while he may feel like an unkillable threat to us as we approach him, he has a far deeper backstory than he'd like us to know about.
I'll tell you a story, true soul, about a man who sold himself, piece by piece. He had everything. A wonderful wife, a brilliant daughter. They lived not far from here.
Well, okay, maybe he's a bit more of an open book than we expected. Before his days as the undead force we see him as now, Kethric had a wife Melodia and a daughter Isabelle whom he loved more than anything else in the world. And he may have even had an extra son in the equation, but I think he'd like us to forget about that one if they are indeed related. Together as a family, they would worship the goddess Selûne, who we discussed earlier. Taking shelter within the glorious architecture of Moonrise Towers, these three would become the golden standard for what dedication to Selûne looked like. Residing here had proved to be more than efficient in embracing everything that came along with the religion as well, since the historic structure was built solely with the purpose of reaching out towards the stars to dry the Moon Maiden's tears. Their unwavering loyalty to the cause was proven to be apparent to the goddess herself as well, as she had sent her own daughter Dame Aelin to fall in love with Isabelle, a note that will have extreme relevance later on in the story. We can even meet the architect of Moonrise, Morfred, within Raphael's House of Hope, where we can get an inside perspective on some of the first events to occur which would go on to shape the once mighty general into the evil man he is today. We come to learn that it was because of his wife Melodia that Kethric continued to worship Selûne as his choice of deity. Once they came together in marriage, it was apparent to all those surrounding the husband and wife that their bond was as strong as could be, and would go on to be a beacon of light for those looking to engage in a life blessed by the Moon Maiden. But Kethric's guiding light would tragically be extinguished not long after.
His wife died too young. Grief tore through their home like a thief, snatching away the scent of her hair, the rustle of her skirts. But the man did not break. He could not break. His daughter needed him whole, after all. She grew up, grew strong, challenged him, filled his heart with such joy it supplanted all sorrow.
Devastated by the loss of his dear wife and mother to his daughter, Kethric turned to that daughter as the only figure who could help cope with his pain. And through a touching letter found in an opulent chest within his room, we can get a glimpse into the perspective of the man's loving wife, and more specifically, her undying dedication to Selûne. In the time following Melodia's passing, Isabelle would be the only thing keeping Kethric's motor running, as he found himself in no position to grieve while concerned about her well-being, especially considering the task Melodia gave to him in her dying breath. Isabelle was also one of Kethric's last strands of attachment to Selûne as a patron deity. As mentioned, it was through his wife in which he chose to live a life in devotion to the moon goddess, after simply following family tradition originally. So once she had passed, it seemed like Kethric hadn't developed much of a personal relationship with their deity beyond what it meant for his daughter, even though it clearly meant so much to his wife in the process of her passing, which makes the following event the absolute last straw in seeking out the help of the Moon Maiden going forward.
When she was killed, the man, he tried to remain whole. But it wasn't possible. Do you understand?
Isabelle, at this point, wasn't just another daughter to a father, but also the last line of defense holding together the mind of a man who has already lost the second most important person in his life, second only to Isabelle. Kethric had no semblance of an idea on how to handle the grief he was forced to endure. So in this blind fit of despair, he had plotted to take vengeance on the goddess which he felt didn't do her role in preserving the lives of some of her most dedicated followers, and in the time to come would turn to Shar instead of Selûne in an attempt to be free of the grief and dread which plagued him. Kethric has a series of diary entries found in-game where we can read perspectives of his during the events we're discussing in the story, and I want to highlight these in particular because the three of them together encapsulate this man's true plummet into darkness and delusion. His very first entry is the most relevant to the topic of his wife and daughter, and it's quite a tough read to get through without feeling the raw humanistic nature of its contents. How can she be gone? Where did she go? The Moon Maiden cannot be so unfeeling, so cruel. Not towards her most devoted servant, not after Melodia. It makes no sense, it makes no sense. I won't survive it, that much I know. Forgetting is the only possibility. The embrace of oblivion, the reprieve of nothingness. It would not be possible for a man to survive knowing what he knows, knowing what can be lost. Shar understands that. Hers is the only mercy I can comprehend. My mind is full of holes, yet not enough. The emptiness, the time, the nothingness, and still I remember. Still I remember it all. There is no mercy in this beating heart. There is no mercy in life at all. Just absolute cold, hard spitting from MC Thorm. This diary entry, more than anything we can find within Baldur's Gate 3, displays the confused and sporadic perspective of Kethric in the wake of the tragedy. At the end of the day, this is just a video game, but the way this passage is written effectively touches the reader on a level of natural human emotion. This is, well, precisely how a man such as Kethric Thorm would react and feel if the two brightest lights in their life were extinguished. Family is such a core value to so many people out there, and the integration of that emotion into the writing of this diary entry causes it to reach a level of immersion that I don't think can be found in many other games out there. He's given up thinking rationally. That much is evident after reading the nature of his sudden exit from Seluna's worship. And as we had gone over in the opening spiel about these two goddesses, Shar isn't exactly in the interest of curing people, even though her following would give such an impression. The Lady of Loss already has quite the vendetta against the Moon Maiden, and since nearly all of the areas surrounding Moonrise Towers and Reithwin Town is under worship of the shiny Nightball in the sky, this new motive adopted by Kethric Thorm may just be the outlet this goddess needed to gain the upper hand in this everlasting conflict between sisters. Rewinding a bit to Daymalin's relationship with Isabelle, you'd be hard-pressed to find another number 2 in line to Kethric Thorm when it came to who grieved over her the most. While being a common point of sadness between the two though, they never bonded over the event in an attempt to get through it easier. As mentioned, Kethric never approved of the relationship between his and Seluna's daughters. A shocking sentiment to hold, to be entirely honest, considering that she was the daughter of his patron god at the time. But after turning to Shar, he granted himself justification in the hesitance to embrace Daymalin as a part of the deal made with Shar to heal him of his grief in return, leading to her eventual plunge into the depths of the Shadowfell as victim of a soul cage, instrumented by the Chosen and his advisor Balthazar, where she would endure countless years of being mortally wounded at the hands of dark justiciars in the area, only to be resurrected back in her cage to strengthen the flame that is her hatred for her lover's father. It's extremely satisfying to understand that while we're experiencing the events which play out within the story of Baldur's Gate 3, they're realistically a part of a much grander scale of a realm that has a complex history far before we even set foot within the game. We are simply being placed into the world with the continuity being what it is at this point in time, which is what benefits the environment of Baldur's Gate 3 from having been a part of the Forgotten Realms as a whole. It provides a narrative without having to build it from the ground up at the start of our adventure. Sure, you may have never experienced these lands in any capacity before, but there will be evidence of the deep history to learn about scattered all throughout the Sword Coast to provide more potency to your role in the story. Back to Kethric Thorm, being fresh out of worshipping Selûne, he sought out the guidance of Shar to help him live with himself after having experienced such tragedy, becoming her chosen.
The pain was unbearable, all-consuming. He decided he would do anything for reprieve. First, he sold himself to the goddess of loss. But the pain did not subside, no matter his obscene feats of devotion.
He would then proceed to raise an army of dark justiciars within the depths of the Thorm Family mausoleum, being in pursuit of conquering the lands around Reithwin Town and Moonrise. Interestingly, this knowledge can give an entirely new perspective to many players' favorite party member Shadowheart, as with this context, we understand that her goal in fulfilling Shar's wishes realistically would place her in the same circles as the armies raised by Kethric Thorm long ago. But it's apparent that the events that take place in Baldur's Gate 3 are far after the raising of Kethric's Justiciar army, so Shar has obviously moved past blessing the once worshipper of Selûne and is now trying to maintain her relevance in this day and age. But what happened between when Kethric raised his legion of dark justiciars and now? Well, quite a bit actually. During the raids on the areas surrounding Moonrise, Kethric Thorm would meet quite the opposition from neighboring regions. In a bandit effort consisting of recognizable figures like Jaheira and Halsin, the Harpers led by Kelvin Arunson and the Druids of the Emerald Grove forced the Chosen of Shar and his forces to fall in a battle at the steps of Moonrise Towers. And while ultimately emerging victorious, it was Kelvin Arunson who had offered a letter of surrender in light of the countless casualties in the clash. Kethric was having none of it though, and continued the encounter, eventually leading to his demise. But in his dying breath, he would whisper a devastating Sharan incantation. The Harpers and Druids would lay the general to rest within his family mausoleum, but considering his worship to the Lady of Loss, they would be a fool to think that the matter has reached its resolution. Not long after this burial, the curse muttered by Kethric Thorm in his last moments took action and swept through the land, plaguing it with the shadow curse that would consume every corner of its historic region for over 100 years. In what is called the Year of Lightning Storms, Shar and her motives would come to dominate this section of the Forgotten Realms. With her chosen slain, she had still achieved the corrupting of the areas surrounding Moonrise Towers, arguably one of the most notable landmarks dedicated to Selûne within Faerûn. And even across the realm, her assassins were successful in swiping the Ebon Diadem from the legendary wizard Eleminster's Tower, an artifact which held a fraction of the Shadow Weave many thought was extinguished long ago, proving that this age-long conflict between sisters may be taking a shift in advantage after all. Regardless, the sadistic nature of the Goddess of Darkness shined through in the end. Her chosen sought out assistance in curing his grief, and though he lost what he left in his passing, it was ultimately Shar's objective which came to fruition, proving even further how the intention of those who fall under her worship don't fall in line with what the Lady of Lost truly has in mind for them. But as we know, Kethric Thorm's story doesn't quite end here, as all of what has happened so far took place prior to the events within Baldur's Gate 3. As we hear throughout the course of Act 1, the notorious general is very much alive, and he's apparently now playing a large role in not only influencing the land surrounding Moonrise, but the entirety of the Sword Coast as well. We find traces of his relevance within the goblins scattered throughout the regions near their encampment, where it seems he has deployed his underlings to disrupt the ability to one half of the united forces which took him down long ago. Knowing the context of his relevance prior, it's interesting to see how in the current state of events, the battered general is apparently even more powerful and influential than his previous heights could begin to understand, and that mighty sentiment will only be reinforced the more we learn about his newfound abilities which came along with his resurrection.
Then, a new god came. A god who promised the man something wonderful. His daughter. Her life returned. Imagine it. He would have to give everything. His body and soul entire. He did not hesitate. Not for a moment.
Calling back to Kethric's binding of Dame Aelin deep down in the Shadowfell, this was initially a plot influenced by Shar and her power over her chosen. But Myrkul found an opportunity to turn the general he planned to direct towards taking over Baldur's Gate in the Sword Coast immortal through this deity's bloodline. As part of the resurrection of the great general, Myrkul would seek that part of the daughter of Soluna's soul be binded to Kethric Thorm as long as she remains trapped in the constructed soul cage. And as we heard straight from Kethric, he didn't waste a second in swiping up this opportunity to resurrect his beloved daughter. So in his mind, this transaction with the Lord of Bones was a no-brainer. If anything, the general felt that his old patron deity blatantly took the light in his life away from him directly. How could she allow such grief to, as he put it, tear through his home like a thief when they adopted the life they did in her worship? But if we were to hear it from the perspective of that resurrected daughter, you would hear a bit of a different approach to her father's apparent plunge into darkness. She hears of and interprets the events as a simple case of a sudden turn to evil tendencies. And even though she understands the circumstances of her resurrection, it seems that she doesn't grasp her father's point of view. The most tragic nature of this entire story involving these characters is that while a family at heart, these parties are operating with entirely different approaches to the matters at hand the entire time. Kethric has always been doing everything in his life in the name of Isabelle, following Soluna, turning to Shar, and the circumstances he finds himself in now. While resulting in actions that can have malintent, it's almost like he has no choice in his own mind but to operate in this fashion. The beacon of light that was his daughter, as he mentioned, was the only reason he was able to stomach the loss of his lovely wife Melodia. So once he was indeed stripped of everything, his only source of reasoning and decision making was gone, turning his attention towards revenge and dissipating his grief, which culminated into a man who, while powerful, is realistically a shell of who he once was. And this only amplified once Myrkul entered the situation. Presenting an opportunity Kethric Thorm likely never thought possible, Myrkul nearly guaranteed access to one of the most devoted chosen he could ever think to have. If he could operate from the motivation of Isabelle in relation to what it would demand of his undead general, it would almost have the same influence as if the request came from her directly. After the actual events of her resurrection though, this proposition would prove to thrust him even further into confusion and emptiness. Through the second of his series of diary entries, we can gain a bit more of a glimpse into the thoughts of Kethric Thorm during this portion of his life story. Forgetting evades me in this infinite darkness. Balthazar is my own sense of the barest comfort, the thought that perhaps she might be brought back to me. If oblivion can fail, what defense have we against death? None except its mastery. Balthazar's words have never felt more promising. It seemed that Balthazar played an instrumental role in the process of bringing back the dearest thing to Kethric, as while the Lord of Bones offered the capability to do so, the action itself still needed to be taken by the now undead general. This also sounds like it takes place quite soon after he took on the mantle of Myrkul's chosen, as Kethric speaks with a sense of skepticism in the wake of being left empty at the hands of Shar. His statements about oblivion failing reinforce the confused state of mind he's in. He's bounced from Soluna to Shar and now to Myrkul, the catch being that none of these indulgences were of his own volition, only following loose promises tossed into the ether from each of them. But this diary entry is about the resurrection of Isabelle Thorm, and as we've learned, she didn't take too kindly to the state of affairs that she was reawoken to witness. Rewinding a bit to our run-in at Last Light, as we can hear from Isabelle herself, she doesn't recognize the man who, in her words, turned against everybody he knew. We've only just met her, but we understand her stance to be firm on the matter. She hates Kethric Thorm. She doesn't openly refer to him as father, and instead uses his full name, proving the detachment present between them. But her father gave her a second chance at life. Even considering the ruthless nature he's adopted as part of turning to both Shar and Myrkul, why would she be so bitter about what it took for him to bring her back? There was quite a bit of mystery surrounding her sudden death, so it seems a bit unfair in the grand scheme of things for her life to have ended so soon. But after everything played out, there was one notable sticking point which kept Isabelle from ever embracing her father again: his imprisonment of Dame Aelin. If we recall the daughter of Selûne's current state of affairs, she's been ruthlessly tortured and experimented on over the past 100 years or so. And even though she was only necessary as part of Myrkul's plans to attach a portion of her soul to Kethric just recently, when she was initially captured by the general long ago in the name of Shar, there was really no reason for her to suffer the way she did at the hands of his advisor and Dark Justiciars. So there's a much deeper reservoir for her on the side of Isabelle, considering what she understands her partner to have endured for so long. In Kethric's mind though, this was all for her. The initial imprisonment was in spite of what the Moon Maiden had gained from his wife and daughter's unwavering devotion, only to allow them to perish so easily. And the separation of souls from Dame Aelin was simply a prerequisite for the Lord of Bones to grant her life once more. But even with this undying hatred for him, there was something he could endure if it meant his little girl was to draw breath again. And later in the story, it'll become evident that his emphasis on her being alive has detached him from all morality. As our adventurers move on from Last Light, after having saved the secluded sanctuary, once we approach Moonrise Towers for the first time, we'll get a taste as to just what kind of a man he has become as a result of the grief he's endured, and all the deals he's made with various deities. In one of the greatest introductions for a villain I may have ever seen, we get a front row seat to just how brutal he is now and how ruthless of an approach he takes to any given life. Our introduction begins with the sentencing of Minthara, if she's alive that is. And her crime is failing to retrieve the astral prism which we possess. Now, as we likely have seen throughout the course of Act 1, these goblins she was given aren't the brightest bulbs on the chandelier, so it's understandable in a way why she wasn't capable of fulfilling her mission. Well, that and the fact that we're capable on our own in preventing her from obtaining it doesn't seem like she stood much of a chance to begin with. Regardless, Kethric Thorm doesn't have an ounce of mercy left in his body, as the gods have made him so cynical that he doesn't value any life other than the one of his daughter. So Minthara isn't afforded much of a court process and is inevitably sentenced to death for her incompetence. But this isn't even the most chilling piece of action from the undead general in this instance. Upon also sentencing the goblins which accompany Minthara to death as well, they'll choose to fight back, and what follows will send a chill down your spine in sheer disbelief as to what is taking place. Taking a halberd to the chest that pierces his bolstered armor, he's sent flying back into his throne. But after a pause, he opens his eyes and arises to his feet, simply shrugging off a blow that would have been overkill on even the strongest of adventurers. And after approaching the trembling goblin before him, he mutters one straightforward order:
Try again.
I hadn't been spoiled to the presence of Kethric Thorm prior to playing through this game for the first time, so this introduction had me shivering knowing that this could be the big bad of the game. Sure, there's mention here and there about Kethric's power and influence, but within this scenario, each and every element present has a purpose to demonstrate the sheer deficit we find ourselves at before the Chosen of Myrkul. The way his underlings take pride in defending his honor when Minthara begins to question the effectiveness of his army, along with the, not dying part, it all works in a way that once this dialogue finishes, the steps forward feel as intimidating as they ever have. And the current state of Moonrise Towers puts a gloomy cap onto the entire scene that was set from the previous interaction. I mean, look at this place! Hearing the glorious tales of the Moonrise Towers and its greatness in the eyes of the followers of Selûne just makes the way it appears to have degraded over the years feel that much more of a punch to the gut. There are traces of the Absolute's presence all over these once legendary halls, causing walls to crumble and the integrity of the building structure to feel like it's being disgraced. Calling back to the state of Moonrise Towers prior to when tragedy first struck the Thorm household, Kethric knew the architect of the glorious landmark of Selûne quite well. So once grief tore through his home and he turned to Shar, Morfred saw a different side of the stalwart man he once knew, and he stood in opposition to the army of Dark Justiciars that would be formed under the Chosen of Shar. Well, not himself, he employed the help of everybody's favorite Cambion, Raphael. Morfred made an infernal deal with Raphael to take care of the Dark Justiciars which wandered the halls of our next objective, the Gauntlet of Shar. So the greedy devil employed the help of his dear friend Yrgir to take care of the job. And as evidence from the song he sings representative of his contract with Raphael, it's safe to say the Justiciar forces were taken care of. We can even come across a spot in the wall while in Grimforge showing the devastation Yrgir caused in his rampage, proving that the Adamantine Forge could even be linked to the history of Shar and the Dark Justiciar armies, considering its vicinity to the ruins that were once built in worship to the mighty deity. Regardless, due to the might of your gear, these halls don't provide much of a challenge to those seeking what's within its depths. And looking back, the Chosen of Myrkul should have probably bolstered these defenses in light of what had happened to ravage its contents, especially considering how important what awaits us in adventuring deeper is to him. Waiting for somebody to free her from these everlasting chains, Dame Aelin can be found in the innermost landmass of the Shadowfell. As we've discussed, a fraction of her soul is bound to Kethric's, and since she herself is immortal, the same goes for him. The only crux which kept us, and frankly anybody, from confronting Kethric Thorm is finally taken care of. And I'm not sure about you, but the nervous excitement I got while making my way from the Shadowfell to the steps of Moonrise Towers was never quite matched for the rest of the game. And this is why I believe that from start to finish, Act 2 contains some of the highest quality storytelling and progression out of all 3 acts we can experience. Act 1 has the awe factor that comes with the nature of the introductory sequences within video games, and Act 3 has an absurd amount of raw content considering its placement within the flagship city of Baldur's Gate, along with the sheer gravity of the matters at hand with the Elder Brain and the other 2 chosen. But Act 2's conflicts felt like they superseded all that came before and after in terms of being dense enough to keep the player on the edge of their seat all the way through. I had heard that there were 3 acts to experience when I first played it, and I knew we hadn't even gotten to Baldur's Gate. I mean, it was the title of the game, though it took some heavy convincing from myself to not feel like these were endgame sequences. It's all framed so well with so much anticipation to have towards the mission's resolution, that once we make the steps towards facing the absolute head-on in Moonrise Towers, we understand just what we're getting ourselves into, even if our target's defenses have been compromised. The siege on Moonrise is not for the faint of heart, but once we make our way to the roof level, we'll finally face the man who has been instrumenting everything we've faced within the Shadow-Cursed lands so far. And depending on some variables and choices we've made along our journey, along with how we proceed in dialogue, this scene can play out in a multitude of ways. As perhaps we didn't raid Moonrise Towers. Maybe you embraced the draw of the Absolute and operated in allegiance with Kethric Thorm. And this is actually the route we need to take in order to engage with the richest iteration of this dialogue on the rooftop. As if we freed the Night Song through either killing or saving her, once we approach the peak of the tower, there won't be much of a conversation, and we'll be thrust right into combat alongside the Night Song if we rescued her. In entertaining Kethric's request, we would have been tasked with retrieving Isabelle from the Last Light Inn to reunite the man and his daughter. And Myrkul's Chosen will have completely polarizing attitudes towards us depending on whether or not we ultimately succeeded in fulfilling his order. We've talked about the conversation with Isabelle and how she can allude to the tainted relationship between her and her father. But as a part of the mission he sent us on to retrieve her, we'll have a bit more confrontational of an experience with the Selenite cleric. Flaming Fist Marcus will be inhabiting the Last Light Inn on the Absolute's behalf, keeping an eye on Isabelle and plotting his own attempt to take her back to his general. And it's within his offer to band together in hopes of delivering her to Moonrise what will make a colossal impact on what will ensue once we approach Kethric Thorm atop the tower. If we had returned Isabelle in one piece, it will almost feel as if Moonrise Towers and the inhabitants of these historic halls are now an extension of your interests as well, considering how we're likely operating from the perspective of one with the Absolute's interest in mind, reinforced by the welcoming nature of Kethric once we begin dialogue with him.
True soul, I was so hoping to thank you in person. Our forces are gathered, the Night Song bound, and we are ready to march at last. But most importantly, Isabelle, you brought my daughter back to me.
Here we can get a less iconic explanation from him concerning the events of his life, composed of lines which give a fresh and humanistic impression on a man which had seemed like the most potent threat we've seen so far. But while being a wholesome feeling conversation, we understand that Isabelle certainly wasn't coming to this family reunion willingly. And considering the tone in which Kethric speaks here, it's a bit unsettling to hear how it seems that her best interests aren't in mind concerning his decision making, even in the events of Isabelle being dead where he says she will live again. He can make it sound like everything is solved in this instance, but his broken and battered history prove that he will never be the man that his little girl looked up to once upon a time. And understanding what awaits deeper if Isabelle is indeed captured though, will put a nail in the coffin as to just how deteriorated this man is. But we aren't quite there yet. We'll be met with the famous "I'll tell you a story, true soul" monologue if Isabelle had fallen in the Battle of the Last Light Inn. And as I've been alluding to throughout this video, it manages to sum up the tragic nature of his tale quite well. Whichever scenario you end up finding yourself a part of though, the end results will align rather similarly, with the Astral Prism being revealed to be in our possession and Kethric Thorm finding it as an opportunity to swipe up the very key in fulfilling his destiny. At this point in time, he's been a part of the Chosen Three with Gortash and Orin long enough to form his own objectives as a part of the Absolute's cause, and it's a constant passive-aggressive battle of motives and intentions between these three Chosen. So any and all advantages that they may be able to hold in terms of receiving praise from the Absolute, they will, resulting in three members of the same cause that don't quite trust each other, and Kethric is no exception with his mission to obtain the Astral Prism. If we inquire from Gortash or Orin later on in the game, we'll find that much of their motivations in aligning with the Absolute is in pursuit of either great power or great influence. All we've heard so far from Kethric Thorm's perspective is that he will go to great lengths in the name of Myrkul, considering what he blessed the man with upon undertaking the role of his Chosen, landing him in a bit of a different situation than the other two, since they operate mostly under their own sense of pride and vision. He's done everything in the name of something other than himself, and even now, having been granted such great potential by Myrkul, he wants nothing but to return the favor in thanks of the blessings he was offered. This is why he feels so approachable in the instance where we returned Isabelle to him. His stint of happiness under the Lord of Bones has peaked in this moment, making him feel like the horrific acts he'll be made to do in the name of his god will have at least some sort of justification if it means having what he thought he had lost forever. But the scenario where Isabelle doesn't reunite with her father proves that the capabilities thrust onto him by Myrkul are hollow to him if what was promised to him didn't work out in the end. If Isabelle is kept alive and away from the grasp of the Absolute, the interactions with Kethric are much more straightforward, especially if we had taken care of the Night Song one way or another as mentioned earlier, and pierced his immortal aura before arriving atop Moonrise, as it seems like he turns on attempting to reunite him and his daughter once he realizes it's out of reach. But his tales of tragedy if Isabelle is killed or returned to him alive end up surfacing as delusion once we approach him in the Mind Flayer colony beneath Moonrise Towers, where one of the most shocking revelations in the game is brought into play. In this scenario where Kethric has his dear Isabelle by his side once more, she's revealed to be a simple thrall under her father's control. His mind may have fallen to the countless tragedies he's endured, but in this instance he's done something that proves he's no longer acting with the interest of Isabelle in mind, but rather his own, seeing that he knows he can't go on without her in the picture, resulting in a complete shell of a man who once upon a time lived in harmony with all of those inhabiting Moonrise Towers, who now disregards any and all perspectives of those who would prevent him from being with his beloved child, even Isabelle herself. And while we now have to hack through Isabelle as part of defeating this vile man, his true nature is revealed once we take him down in his elvish form. As he falls to our party, he surrenders all of his will to Myrkul.
It is no matter, for I am death, and I am not the end. I am the beginning.
This sequence proves that he isn't after the true embrace of his daughter again at this point. He's obsessed with the idea of how Myrkul granted him the one thing he thought he could never have again. And while that was Isabelle, it seems that Myrkul giving him this opportunity has vaulted the Lord of Bones over the very moonlit cleric he thought would solve his torment. But once this colossal opponent is taken down as well, I'll have been proven wrong in my previous statements, as we can find a note on the Chosen of Myrkul's body which reinforces who the most influential figure truly is to him, Isabelle. And this, coupled with the final addition in the series of diary entries, says it all. Melodia would understand if she knew my aim. She too, I believe, would have turned to Myrkul under such conditions as these. Our darling will live again. What kind of man would I be if I didn't raise the world entire for her sake? In victory, we don't exactly feel...
The rats! Together, we have crushed him! Brain and body!
said, in victory, we don't really feel fulfilled, other than the fact that the obstacle in front of us is taken care of. We were forced to take down a man who, while being a threat to us, was only so because of a life lived full of torment and anguish. That doesn't stop us from engaging with him in pursuit of our ultimate goal at hand, but it makes his parting words leave us with a hint of sympathy towards him as we move towards Act 3 and Baldur's Gate.
Isabelle,